Well, it's Sunday morning, and now that I've got you here, let's all step into hell. 3 people have been imprisoned in a single room, without windows, furnished in Second Empire furniture, in a condition of permanent artificial light and with a door which is shut and usually locked, but can also sometimes be opened. They can never sleep. They get occasional visions of the continuing lives and judgments of those that have been left behind on earth. They can never blink, nor can they die. Garcin is the editor of a pacifist newspaper in Brazil. He is desperate to convince the others that he died too soon, apparently in an act of cowardice, but that had he lived longer, it would have become evident that he was in fact a hero. Estelle is a vain and attractive young woman, and she attempts to seduce Garcin, but only in exchange for his overlooking the fact that she murdered her child for the sake of a man's attentions. Inez is an older woman, a lesbian, who is also continually pointing out to both Garcin and Estelle that they are, respectively, a coward and a murderer. At the same time, she is desperate for Estelle to acknowledge her as an object of attraction and a superior attraction to Garcin's, something which Estelle is unable or unwilling to do. Garcin and Estelle cannot consummate their passion because Inez is ever present to taunt and make fun of them. At the same time, Inez wishes that Garcin could simply disappear so that Estelle's need for love and approval will be focused upon her. And Estelle, meanwhile, cares little for either Garcin or Inez, and hunts in vain for a mirror so that she can apply her makeup properly and so ensure the attractiveness of her appearance, which is, of course, for her, the confirmation of her identity. This circle of mutual anguish, shame, accusation, and counter-accusation, denial, and objectification is repeated over and over and over again throughout Sartre's play Huis Clos, which is sometimes translated as in camera and sometimes translated as no exit. At the end of the play, after various individual thoughts are revealed, after various individual truths are revealed and confronted, all 3 characters resign themselves to the truth. To quote, "So this is hell. You remember all we were told about the torture chambers, the fire and brimstone, the burning oil, old wives' tales. There is no need for red-hot pokers. Hell is other people." Well, as you may have ascertained by now, It must be said that Sartre's view of human relationships is fundamentally pessimistic. What value might such an outlook have for issues surrounding conflict resolution? A good deal, I believe. And I will now make an attempt to convince you of such. And probably oversimplify some basic messages that Sartre presents for us in his Sartre. There is a fundamental assumption. For each of us, a basic and inescapable conflict exists. This is the tension between what might be called our actuality and our facticity. Our actuality presents us with the freedom to be as we can be within the limits of our possibilities. It permits us to transcend the definitions, the labels, the habitual stances and attitudes with which we have cloaked ourselves, and instead to remain open to the potential and the possibility of our existence. Well, this is all very nice. However, there is a price for this actualizing freedom. The price is the recognition of the inescapability of choice within it. We are condemned to choose, says Sartre. Now, the realization of this inescapability of choice is accompanied by the experience of anguish. We become aware that there is no objective criterion or value which could guarantee or vindicate our actions in any absolute fashion. In actualization, no meaning is left or possible. Our facticity, on the other hand, continually moves us toward encasing and capturing our freedom, essentializing it through what might be seen as the objectifying realities of life. Our bodies, our culture, our place within an historical framework. Our facticity calms our anguish, removes many of the burdens of actuality. It provides us with meaning. But the move towards facticity also has its price. If facticity permits us to escape the anguish of freedom, we are, as a result, brought to the experience of shame that is provoked by our willingness to adopt a servile unfreedom. Our very search for meaning belittles us, makes us less than the being we are. So for Sartre, we are nothing pretending to to be something. And therein lies the source to all of our conflicts. However, what is crucial for Sartre is that our very awareness and response to this personal and subjective conflict does not arise as a result of some internalized, isolated, intra-psychic mechanism of tension, but rather is an interrelational consequence. For Sartre, self and other are inextricably bound together in an inescapable relationship. If my life projects are attempts to fulfill my actuality, the presence and demands of others serve to remind me of my facticity. As such, Sartre argues that the dilemma we all face is that each of us is locked in continual and unceasing struggle with others. This struggle is no minor thing. The prize is nothing less than actuality. When two people meet, a struggle begins between each person's desire to be perceived as a transcendent, actualizing subject and to avoid being captured as a defined and limited object. Each person wants the same, and each person fears the same. And each places the outcome of the struggle, be it success or failure, in the hands of, or more accurately, in the gaze of the other. Now, there is an example that Sartre utilizes to capture this dilemma, and I think it's as usual, a very compelling and brilliant example that he presents us with. Sartre asks us to imagine a person in a corridor. He walks along the corridor and he notices and is intrigued by a closed door. He's irresistibly tempted. We don't know quite why, whether it's because of curiosity or jealousy or vice, to get down on his knees and to look or peek through the keyhole. And as he bends down, he is riveted by what is opened to his gaze. What he sees is another person undressing, oblivious to his presence. Now, in this moment of gazing, the person who peeks experiences himself as pure actuality. Every possibility set by the circumstance is open to him. His power within such a situation is overwhelming. He is at one with his behaviors. He is the subject of his own story. But unfortunately, this will not last. For all of a sudden, as he is glorying in his power, his knowledge, his awareness, his possibilities, he hears a noise somewhere in the background behind him. And as he turns, he suddenly sees that there is another who is looking at him. And the other's gaze petrifies him. In that moment, the person peeking through the keyhole experiences a rapid shift of perception and finds himself having a far more disagreeable experience. He is now embarrassed, uncomfortable, shamed. What has happened? He has suddenly found himself to be the object of another's gaze and is now conscious of the way in which the other looks at him, judges him. Not only might this person now come to the conclusion that he is being viewed as a peeping Tom, his conclusion is likely to be, I am one. He has been impaled upon the label and categorization via the transformative power of the other's opinionated gaze. So what happens to this person at the keyhole? The person, we are told, will suffer the discomfort, the embarrassment, the shame of the other's look, and will later go away and rely upon some form of bad faith, perhaps a lie of some sort, or perhaps the suppression of the event, or perhaps a transformation of its experienced meaning into something quite different, perhaps an excuse or other. I was just really bending down to tie my shoelace and happened to cast my gaze into the keyhole. And this excuse will explain away the objectifying gaze and experience of the other. Perhaps this person will even convince himself that it was the other all along who had intended to gaze into the keyhole, and that his own act had prevented a truly perverse or disgusting or violent scenario from having occurred. So the person might even turn his act into a heroic one. Now, given the circumstances of such self-other relations, what way out is there? For Sartre, there is none, of course. For Sartre, the other steals my projects and gives them another meaning. For Sartre, the other rewrites my scripts. For Sartre, the other seeks to rid me of my freedom. Now these, I think, are important messages for those of us who practice as psychotherapists or counselors. We are the other, and the client is our other. And how much of the process that takes place is a process of stealing projects, rewriting scripts, assuming other meanings, demanding a freedom that is ours rather than the others, and vice versa. If we cannot escape from this, what is possible? Well, initially for Sartre, what is possible, or what we attempt, is a series of maneuvers, a series of stances that might serve in part to allay the presence of the dilemma. Here are the most common ones, according to Sartre. The first stance or maneuver we might adopt is a masochistic one. In order to be approved by the other, and in that way perhaps retain some of my actualizing project, I must attract the other's attention in such a way that the other experiences me as an object of interest or desire. But even if I achieve this, however, I become a slave to the other's master. I become a thing, no matter how interesting or wise or attractive, still a thing for the other to limit my possibilities. So if my masochistic stance is not entirely successful, what if I were to adopt a sadistic stance instead? So in order to retain or recapture my former freedom, I must in some way reduce the power of the other in my project. I can achieve this by reversing the masochistic scenario and by ensuring that I perceive the other as an object for my wants and desires, and that the other accepts this objectification. Now, this is unlikely to happen without my resorting to coercion or even violence. But this too will only serve to capture me, in that I am forced to concede the other's control of my project, in forcing me to adopt such strategies. And further, even if I should succeed, the other who now confirms me does not do so willingly, is but a slave reduced to the conditions of being a mere object. And this will bring me no lasting comfort. So, how about a further stance? How about if I adopt a stance of indifference? If I become indifferent to all of my relations with others by denying the possibility of any form of rapport with others, well, this may at least succeed in providing me with at least a partial resolution to the getting on with my actualizing project. But no, my very determination to avoid others ties me even more to them. I must now avoid them at all costs. As an example of this, way back in the 70s, there used to be a humanistic game that was played where two people were placed in front of each other and were told, one of you is only allowed to say no, and the other of you is only allowed to say please. And the object of the game is for the person who says please to try and convince the person who says no to give them whatever it is that the pleasing desire might be. Now, initially, in the agenda, it would seem like the person in power is the one who says no, and the person who has no power is the one who is going around saying please. But when the game actually begins, and the two partners play with each other and are going, no, no, please, please, what begins to happen is that the one who says no finds himself or herself increasingly escaping from and feeling frightened by the please demands of the other. So the one who says please actually attains more power. Neither one of them gets what they want, but the one who says no and tries to avoid actually gets much more caught up and lost in the demands of the other. And I think this is part of this notion of indifference that Sartre is presenting us with. So if the indifferent stance doesn't work, what other stance is available to me? Well, another stance, Sartre says, is what about the scapegoat stance? What about if I can attempt to create a view of a persecutory outsider, perhaps some other who disturbs me and some others, and in that way disturbs us both. In this way, I and these particular others can attribute evil to the outsider and create a false sense of harmony and social community between myself and some others, some chosen others. As such, we now seem to be joined in a mutual exercise of limiting the power of the scapegoated other, or even in seeking to eradicate the scapegoat's existence. So just think of current propaganda surrounding, you name it, Israelis, Palestinians, terrorists, communists, fascists, unwanted immigrants, the axis of evil, and so forth. And you begin to see the power of Sartre's argument. But at the same time, we also realize that this community of self and others is a creation of social actualization that diminishes and excludes the personal project. And as such, it is bad faith at a societal level as well. Well, okay, another strategy, one that you might all connect to, perhaps more readily than this one. Maybe all others but one are my antagonists. If I can fall in love with one other, then maybe through that relationship, I can find the possibility of this actualizing project. So, in falling in love, each lover wants two possibilities: to be the provider of the other's freedom, and in turn, to be provided freedom by the beloved. But how? Each must possess the freedom of the beloved as his or her own means to freedom. The lover wants the beloved's freedom so that it can be glued down and turned to serve his or her own possibilities of freedom. The lover must be secure in the gaze of the beloved. But to achieve this, lover and beloved paradoxically abdicates his or her freedom and demands the abdication of the other's freedom. You can be free, each says to the other, but only insofar as that freedom rests upon your acknowledged wish to be bound to and by me. It is I, not you, who determines the confines and boundaries of your freedom. So each lover must become an ever fascinating, ever desirable object designed to seduce the beloved. And this too cannot succeed. The beloved will begin to love the object that I have become, and not me. If my falling in love provided me with an initial sense of freedom potential, the experience and struggle of my remaining in love and of my beloved's remaining in love with me is one of ever increasing and demanding containment and restriction. Well, what if I just hate others? Let me just hate all others. Well, again, hate implies the recognition of the other's freedom. He or she does not act or is not how I want him or her to be. To hate is to be reminded of my own lost possibilities, my own loss of freedom, the power of the other over me. And what is the felt experience of all these failed attempts? Anguish, shame, self-deception, disgust of self and of others. Every human enterprise may begin with the best of intentions, but will eventually turn into its opposite. What begins as an attempt at actualization becomes the facticity of oppression. If we stay with Sartre's argument, what implications might there be for conflict resolution, whether in the form of psychotherapy or coaching or mediation, be it between individuals, organizations, or nations? If Sartre is correct, then it must also be the case that conflict is inevitable. The other, be it therapist or client, coach or coachee, confronting or confronted parties in a mediation caucus, the other remains inescapably my antagonist. The various strategies that are adopted in any such instances reveal themselves to be all too reminiscent of the more general strategies that I summarized before. And you might find it interesting and illuminating the next time you read your newspaper to read the articles in the light of the various strategies that were outlined. You might be surprised by what you begin to see. So is there truly no way out? Well, Sartre certainly pondered over this dilemma a great deal. And in his later writings, he became more willing to consider a potential alternative relationship, which, fraught with peril as it was nonetheless permitted the possibility of an alternative possibility. It's not real, he couldn't see it anywhere, but because he could imagine it, it had to be allowed to be considered. So what is this possibility that Sartre began to consider? Well, the source of it lies in Heidegger. And it lies in Heidegger's insight that by others, we do not mean everyone else apart from or other than me. Those against whom the I stands out. Rather, others are those among whom one is as well. It's not a separation of self-others. In every other is me as well. So for Sartre too, others are not only a given of existence in the world, but are also the way through which we perceive our own existence. Our experience of being the object of someone else's gaze brings us to our own awareness of ourselves as agents. Now, let me give you a personal example from this. I'm not sure how real it is. It is a memory that I tell myself as part of my story. The story of how I came to be. And in that memory, I see myself as a 3-year-old child on a ship sailing from Italy to Canada. And I'm with my parents, as I have been on every other day on that sailing, walking along one of the main decks of the ship and playing my parents' game with them. And my parents' game consists of the equivalent of fetching a stick that a dog might catch. There was no dog around. My parents were missing their dog, so I became the substitute. And instead of a stick, it was a ball. And I can, in my story, my father is throwing a ball down the deck, and I run after it to catch it and then bring it back to him. And then he does the same thing, and we keep playing this game. Well, in this memory that I tell myself is the moment of my becoming an aware being. I capture this moment where I bend down to catch the ball, as I have been doing so over and over and over again, and suddenly I realize that I am a being who exists apart from these. That I have the capacity of doing something with this ball that is unexpected. I could stop catching it, I could throw it over the deck, I could get on my hands and knees and mouth and yap around. I could do any number of possible things. And in that moment, I experience in my story a sense of oppression of my parents, but also that their power and oppression has brought me to my awareness of my own being, my actualizing being. So this is the idea that Sartre gets from Heidegger and which he then begins to play with. And he calls this stance, this potential attitude, a novel stance of being for others. And this being for others emerges as the result of a conscious being's ability to consider the world which is perceived by another such being. Being for others rests upon the acceptance of a mutuality of being between beings. And through it, we each come to recognize our inescapable reliance upon others for our very sense of self, our very ability to recognize actuality and facticity. But make no mistake, for Sartre, conflict is the original meaning of being for others. The move to being for others is not through the abdication or denial of conflict, but rather through the very acceptance of its inevitability, through the ritual, through the mutual embracing of the possibilities that emerge through mutual conflict. And I think one possible example of this at a world level was the Truth and Reconciliation hearings that took place in South Africa. I'm not sure how successful they were as an example of this, but they were an attempt to embrace mutuality through the recognition of inevitable and inescapable conflict, not trying to deny it, but working through it, with it. And again, not assuming that through it, conflict could be conquered or minimized or removed, but rather that it was through conflict and the willingness to embrace the mutuality of it that something new could emerge. So, how might this idea of an attempt at conflict resolution along Sartrean lines begin to look? The School of Psychotherapy and Counselling developed a mediation and dispute resolution program based upon Sartrean and more general existential principles. As its basic stance, it takes the view that disputes exist not only between separate or competing parties, but are equally and simultaneously present within the worldview of each participant. And therefore, one of the fundamental focus points in this approach to mediation is that of considering, exploring, and unraveling each party's various self-focused and other-focused relations and motivations. Now, this focus upon interrelational issues permits each party to gain a more accurate awareness of the complex and contradictory structure which makes up his or her values, motivations, beliefs, and behaviors. More often than not, the inadequate awareness and understanding of one's various motivations allows their competing concerns and interests to remain unclear and unseen. So, for instance, consider the following brief vignette of a mediation meeting between a married couple engaged in an acrimonious divorce dispute. In the course of the discussion, the couple defined their primary presenting problem as being their inability to develop a satisfactory sexual relationship. Now, the caucus session revealed that the sexual concerns, while undoubtedly real and relevant to them, also serve to hold and express a far wider area of concern, which had remained obscured. It emerged that each partner felt the other to be overwhelmingly and oppressively powerful in the relationship, and that each experienced major difficulties in maintaining his or her own sense of self-esteem while in the presence of or while relating with his or her spouse. So these wider interpersonal issues were most clearly exemplified in their sexual relations. But their sexual problems in themselves were not causes to their conflict, but rather consequences of a far wider set of worldview issues. In fact, it could now be seen by the couple rather than with each other, each other with regard to permitted each to be more willing to consider how he or she became this oppressively powerful person to the other, and equally whether the way of engaging with the other, which each adopted, succeeded in addressing the most important elements of the complex worldview which each sought to embody. Now, if participants are better able to reveal their worldviews in a far more accurate and widely encompassing fashion, and through this face their own sets of demands and vulnerabilities, then this in turn may permit an antagonistic attitude to be replaced by a mutually created and mutually responsible working alliance. Through is a sense of humor, an ability to see things in their ridiculous and absurd dimensions, to laugh. Those who have retained the capacity to recognize their own ridiculousness or even meaninglessness cannot be proud and cannot be enemies of the open society. If only those who refuse to laugh in the Far East, in the Middle East, in Washington, could hear such a message. It wouldn't remove the conflict that exists, but it would change its very nature. It would change it to a conflict of mutuality. So sometimes the world seems a very bleak place indeed, whether because of personal circumstances or those of the more international variety. It is in those moments, I believe, that our willingness to embrace our human existence is truly tested, and we are confronted with the full brunt of our own and the world's imperfection. Now, I don't know about you, but in my own life, I have found that as painful as they are, such moments also permit a certain numinous transcendence. Perhaps that is just some self-protective, self-defensive device. I can't say. But whatever, I have found myself sustained by such. And among those things that have sustained me, I count the work of Sartre. I hope that through this discussion, I have not done too much damage to his ideas. And I also hope that in some mutually acknowledging way, I have provoked you to consider or reconsider your ideas surrounding conflict and its resolution. So I leave you with one final Sartrean-inspired sermonette. Even if hell truly is other people, do not forget that the voice that welcomes you therein can only be your own. Thank you.
So we have time for a few questions.
Yeah.
My gradual familiarity with Sartre is kind of associated with chain smoking, coffee drinking, this misogynistic, misanthropic kind of guy.
Yeah.
Approach the world with an attitude of discord. And the first part of the talk we quoted that impression. Again, my gradual understanding of existential philosophy is that the first principle is being essence. Being essence, not be. What you do here and now, as your challenge moment to moment, day to day, defines what you are. I'm wondering where that postulate, I've not heard that postulate at this conference. And I'm wondering where it fits into your scheme of things, to your image of existential.
What, the postulate that existence precedes essence? That postulate? That being is essence. Not quite. I mean, I think you're trying to capture something that actually, in many ways, does come from Sartre, and it's this dichotomy that isn't a dichotomy that is presented to us. That there is this challenge that every the possibility of being that we are is constantly undergoing a process of being captured, being bound in identity, in history, in body, in any number of ways. And our dilemma is the attempt to both be as agents of being and equally to exist as embodied beings, as beings who are limited and bound through the relations of that we each engage in with the world. So for Sartre, that's the conflict that we find ourselves in, and in that sense, there's no way out. Now, how might that feed into a broader existential perspective? Well, I suppose one way that it feeds into it is by following it through and asking ourselves, if this is so, then we can neither pretend that we can be this full being, nor can we also pretend that we are just the being that is defined and definable. And if that is so, then all that we can do is to embrace that which emerges through this. To use a kind of silly catchword or phrase, to say yes to what's there. Whether it, and in that saying yes, it's not that it allows us to escape this dilemma, but it gives us the possibility of seeing in not just in a visual sense, but seeing in a full sense what remains possible for us within those conditions. So it's not an idea of freedom that is an absolute freedom, nor is it an idea of freedom that is individualistic. The great mistake that people make when they read Sartre is that they imagine that what he's saying is, go and be whoever you want to be, as if who you are can exist on its own, can be defined on its own. And that's not Sartre's statement at all. Sartre's statement is the recognition that our sense of ourselves is always within the context of others. And as such, it's not individual freedom that he's talking about. It's an intersubjective freedom, a freedom that encompasses self and others. And that takes away much of the kind of the solipsistic excesses of freedom that our politicians would like to have us adopt.
Yeah. But not quite. It doesn't quite take it away. I'd like for you to explain a little more sort of later Sartre. If Sartre were to write his keyhole scenario again, would it be possible that the person who is caught looking, turn around, recognize that he has done something wrong, see that this other has, as a matter of fact, liberated his freedom to do otherwise than be a peeping Tom, freedom to join with that other and do something else or whatever it may be. So would later Sartre really get to that other? So it's not just working together with, but that other has given you my freedom?
Well, certainly that's there. That the other might give me my freedom, I think is certainly part of that equation. At the same time, another part of the equation would also clearly be the possibility that nothing changes. I remain the felt peeping Tom that I am, or that the other experiences me to be, but it's not about some kind of obvious event level change. It's change of relational interaction. The other element of it that you're not bringing in is the impact on the other. It might allow the other who sees me and captures me in that to also admit his or her own possibility of having been on his knees looking at the keyhole. So it although it doesn't change us in our behaviors possibly, it changes the way we look at ourselves and one another through those behaviors.
Well, and I admit that could happen, but on the other hand, I could also say that Sartre really took too much of Heidegger being with others and really didn't quite get to the being for others. So that the two of them...
I agree. I mean, he certainly didn't fill in that notion of being for others anywhere near as much as he does for the other two. But okay, that's our work.
And thank you. And thank you very much. And the conversation shall continue.